I had the same feedback.
Yeah.
Did not turn out good.
Well, it's funny because during the Clinton administration, there was a shift push to classified, and my neighbors were involved in that. They grabbed them back.
Turns back this way.
It was contradictory as president.
Yes. The one
I know they all bad.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Lidfach, Director of Division of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to another in our ongoing meetings in the Terrorism and Homeland Security series that is co-sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Center, the RAND Corporation, and the Dwight D. Eisenhower National Security Series of the U.S. Army. It's a particular pleasure to welcome General Caslen here today, who's the Deputy Director for the War on Terrorism at the Pentagon, to provide today's briefing. The Woodrow Wilson Center and the RAND Corporation are most grateful for the Army's support of this series through the Eisenhower National Security Series. We welcome you here today. Just an administrative note that the next meeting in this series will be on March 20th, and the speaker will be Chris Harmon, who holds the Adamson Chair of Insurgency and Terrorism at the Marine Corps University, and his topic will be How Terror Groups End. Now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Bruce Hoffman, head of the RAND Corporation's Washington office, co-chair of this series, who will introduce today's topic and the speaker. Bruce?
Thanks, Rob. Let me also welcome you all. Let me especially welcome General Caslen, who we're delighted to have with us, and feel particularly fortunate to have us here to speak today. As Rob introduced General Caslen, he's currently the Deputy Director for the War on Terrorism within the Joint Staff Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate. And among his responsibilities are providing strategic policy and planning guidance in support of the global war on terrorism. He's also the Joint Staff Liaison for Worldwide Detainee Matters as well. General Caslen is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He holds master's degrees in business administration from Long Island University and also from Kansas State University. And he's a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He served on the faculty at West Point, where he was also an Army football coach, and his previous assignment before coming to the Pentagon and to the Joint Staff was as Commander for Maneuver, 3rd Infantry Division Mechanized, which has units at Fort Stewart, Hunter Army Airfield, and Fort Benning, Georgia. General Caslen, welcome.
Bruce, thank you very much. You're probably wondering what the heck a football coach was doing about strategy for the Department of Defense. So am I. But maybe that has some of it to do with it. First of all, I want to say thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and it's really an honor just to be among your presence. I looked in the audience and see some great colleagues and some people that I've worked with in the last couple of years on the war on terrorism, And truly, this is a distinguished audience, and hopefully the presentation will meet your expectations. I also want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center, sir, and the RAND Corporation, Bruce, for your great support in hosting this series. I think the fact that you have an Eisenhower series, all the way back to why they even named it an Eisenhower series after our president, and the fact that we get together in this community within Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway, and we can talk about these issues and dialogue about these issues. I think it's so very important. You know, Huntington said that there's a clash of civilization. Those who really argue with him say it's not a clash of civilization, it's a dialogue among civilizations as an alternative. And truly, it's forums and institutions like this that really establish the opportunity to dialogue about this war on terrorism, what this is all about. So, Woodrow Wilson Center RAND Corporation, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be associated with each of you. I do want to talk to you about the global war on terrorism from the Department of Defense's perspective. You might have saw as this was advertised, and I also want to thank you for your flexibility. I think this date was moved around a couple times, and thank you very much for the flexibility of accommodating my schedule and everything. But as this was moved around, you might have saw it was advertised that these are Department of Defense initiatives. And that's the way we originally advertised it. But the fact of the matter is something came out here recently which was called the Long War Briefing that you might have seen either in the Early Bird or some other type of press. And what I'd like to do is to give you excerpts of the Long War Briefing that our office was responsible for. Embedded in this briefing for the Long War, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy. We're going to talk about the military strategy and the United States government strategy and how we're putting together the plans to deal and operationalize that strategy as well. Not necessarily part of the Long War Briefing, but it gives you some good perspectives from the Department of Defense. Okay, let me have the next slide. So this is our agenda. Probably talk for about 45 minutes, and we'll transition for a good 30 or so minutes worth of questions and answers or so. And I'll stay as long as my schedule will allow, even afterwards, and even give you my card so we can take follow-on questions if necessary. I do want to talk initially about the nature of the conflict and the nature of the enemy. When I got into my job about 2 years ago within the Department of Defense, really the Department of Defense itself had not yet settled on what was the nature of this war. Combatant commands had their own perspective, services had their own perspective, different organizations even within the department, within OSD and the Joint Staff had their own perspective. And all of us in uniform learned a long time ago that intelligence drives operations, so the understanding of the nature of the war and the understanding of the nature of the enemy is going to drive what your strategy is going to be. And since we all had different perspectives about what the nature of this war is, we all had different strategies about how to deal with it. And as a result, we lacked something that was essential, at least within the Department of Defense, and that was integrating and synchronizing our efforts. In March 2005, we published the National Military Strategic Plan for the War on Terrorism. And in this series last year, we actually gave, in one of these forums, a presentation on the National Military Strategic Plan. We published it in a classified version and an unclassified version about a month or so ago, which is on the street right now. But that became, for the Department of Defense, the authoritative document which defined the nature of the war and the nature of the enemy from our perspective, and therefore what the military strategy would be for the war on terrorism. I do want to take some time and talk about that because I think fundamentally that's extremely important. There are some implications of this war for those of us who live in free and open societies. We'll discuss some of that. And probably the most important thing in this presentation is that fourth bullet, our strategy for success. And then a couple slides on why we think this is a long war and what does it take to commit to it. Next slide. This slide kind of lays out some of the foundation and the principle about what the issues are within Islam in this war on terrorism. Back in the 14th century, when Islam was at its zenith, there was a significant piece of land that it occupied. Its culture was extensive. In its time of preeminence, Islam would call itself occupying a caliph or a caliphate. That's not a bad word. It's when Islam was at its zenith in terms of its cultural influence in the land that it occupied. But since then, there was a significant declination. And what happened that as it declined over time, all the way up to the point of 1960s and the 1970s, when a group of Arab countries tried to get together to eliminate a small, non-Arabic Zionist state within its midst. And not only did they fail in trying to eliminate it, but they were humiliated. There was disgrace associated with that, and they really got their backsides handed to them. And what followed was a steady stream of perceived indignities at the national level, I'd say at the regional level, and even at the global level. And at the heart of these, further, United States and Western policies were at the core of each one of these perceived injustices. Some of these U.S. policies had to do with how, and Western policies had to do with how the United States perceived its support of the Palestinian movement, or Kashmir situation, or what was going on in Chechnya, and the lack of United States leadership and involvement. Some of those policies were with regard to how the United States supported the United Nations on various issues, whether it was the United Nations supporting or not supporting what was going on in Israel, as compared to what the United States would support with the United Nations efforts in Iraq. And to the Islamic community, the perceived intolerance and injustices that were associated with that, from collateral damage with the combat that were associated with the combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the collateral damage that victimized a lot of the Islamic society and the innocent people. But in the middle of all that, as a result of the lack of honor and dignity, as a result of United States and Western policies that were at the core, they're developed, and actually what you see right now is a underlying theme of a lack of dignity and honor within Islam. And as a result, there's a desire to retaliate or to do something about that. Next slide. If you couple that underlying lack of dignity and honor with this globalization incursion of Western influence, what we really develop at this particular point is this struggle of ideas within Islam. And I don't want to be offensive in any way to Islam, but I want to try to be as simplistic as I can in trying to define some of the ideologies that exist within Islam, as you see them across the spectrum, in order to try to better explain this struggle of ideas. And let's just say at the far left you have secular Islam, and then as you move to the right you have this moderate or mainstream element of Islam. Moderate Islam is defined by those who believe in the principles that you see up there on the left in green of tolerance, plurality, and inclusion. Differences are resolved through dialogue, thus dialogue of civilizations that we talked about before. As I move to the right a little bit, now we have this element within Islam that are traditionalists or fundamentalists. And they would be characterized that they believe in the orthodoxy of Islam, preeminent in all elements of society, all the way from its government down through its religious sector, all the way down into its economy. And then if I move, nothing wrong with that, but if I move over further to the right, I get this extremist element of Islam that really believes that you see in the right there under the red arrow, a radical intolerant interpretation. They believe in the expulsion of infidels. They support the establishment of a land for a safe haven for terrorist planning, operation, and launching of operations. They support denial of political and religious rights, a violation of women's rights, and really reestablishing Islam to its level of preeminence both culturally and where it was in landmass through use of violent means. So overarching in all of this struggle is, how do you deal with modernity and the incursion of the West? Moderates would say we need to dialogue about it, not that we would accept that, but we need to dialogue and discuss it. There is some plurality that can occur. Extremists would say we want to establish a Islamic state, a radical Islamic state, just think of Taliban-run Afghanistan, and totally deny any incursion of Western culture and globalization into our area whatsoever. So you have this struggle of ideas. And if I took the Islamic population and put it across that spectrum, just picture a bell-shaped curve. And depending on who is making the case to the Islamic population, that curve will migrate to the right if extremists are making the case, or that curve can migrate way to the left if moderates are making the case. And that's kind of the struggle of ideas. And we're going to talk about that, and I'll come back and refer to it particularly as we talk about our strategy. Next slide. What I want to show you now is a little description or a policy definition within the Department of Defense on the nature of the enemy. So if you understand that nature of the war and the struggle of ideas within Islam, this lack of dignity and honor that is preeminent through all of Islamic society, and you couple that with this extremist radical element within Islam, this is what I'm going to describe to you right now, the nature of the enemy. And we say it is a transnational movement of extremist organizations, networks, and individuals. All of our societies have extremists. I mean, we in America have our own extremists within our own society, but what's unique in this particular case are the fact that they use violence to include terrorism as a means to accomplish ideological ends. Some people would argue, and we even had this debate within the Defense Department, that this is really a global insurgency. We concluded we don't go that far. We say transnational movement in terms of the ideology that spreads. I kind of think of it back in the 1960s, those of us who are that age remember Beatlemania, and as the Beatlemania came from Europe back to the United States and then went back to Eastern Europe across the Berlin Wall. Kind of this ideology that's spreading itself. But we don't say it, but we do not go as far as to say it has that global insurgency because it lacks the centralized command and control aspects. We say primary in the enemy is Al-Qaeda and its associated movements. And some people would say, what is the ideology and the description of ideology within Islam that describes Al-Qaeda and their associated movements? And we say it is of the Sunni sect, of the Salafist teaching, which really believes in this orthodoxy of Islam, that is taught through the Wahhabist school. And what's unique about this radical extremist element is this thing called Takfirism. And those of you who know what Takfirism says, that if there is somebody who doesn't agree with my belief system, then I have the authority to use violence to include murder to eliminate them totally. And that's like what you see that's occurring in Iraq, for example, with Al-Qaeda of Iraq because of the sectarian violence that is resulting there because of between the Shias and the Sunnis. Do we say that Sunni Salafists are bad? I remember General Abizay telling the story that I gave this presentation and was trying to describe the nature of the threat to some of the leadership in Kuwait, and I was saying that they were all Sunni Salafists, referring to the bad guys, and then the person he was giving the presentation to said, well, I'm a Sunni Salafist and I'm not bad. And rightly so. But it's the Sunni Salafism taught through the Wahhabi school that believes in that element of Takfirism that really defines that radical interpretation. Some people would ask, is it just strictly Sunnis that we're in conflict with? What about the Shia element? The fact of the matter is, before 9/11, there were more Americans killed through Shia Hezbollah than any other terrorist organization. Interestingly enough, for the most part, they've stayed on the sidelines for the last 4 years or so in the war on terrorism. But they have a tremendously radical ideology that is very extremist, and they have significant capabilities. And it goes without saying that they also have a violent extremism ideology that is worth watching. We say that this extremist element exploits Islam and uses terrorism to include assassinations and murders as a means to accomplish ideological ends. Terrorism is the means. We further define terrorism as assassination and murder because we want to make the case that a jihadist, to some people, may be considered and emulated as a freedom fighter, but to somebody else, we define him as a murderer, which resonates with all societies and all ethnicities. That is the unlawful taking of life. And that's why we put murder in there. We further define the nature of the adversary as state and non-state supporters. And some of these state and non-state supporters are support through their ideological motivations, and other because they're just corrupts and they form alliances of convenience. And they seek to overthrow and control apostate Muslim nations. And well, I think if you can see the slide, I'll just keep going just a little bit. But let me just bring you to attention to that last bullet before the yellow box. that if you take that bell-shaped curve and if you just say, for example, that the extremist element of that spectrum is just 1% of Islam who believe in this ideology, well, given the total population of Islam is 1.2 billion, if you do your math from grade school, if you remember, 1% of 1.2 billion equates to 12 million people. So if you're going to drain the swamp, it would be a pretty tough task to be able to do that for 12 million personnel. The yellow block makes the case that although he may or we may conclude that his beliefs are misguided, he is absolutely committed to them. A grievance-led population fuels it, and because of this extremist ideology, there are other recruits that are willing to join the ranks. Next slide. In further defining the nature of the adversary, there's a couple interesting phenomena that we want to show in the next couple slides. First is this increased capabilities. And I want to draw your attention to the quote on the bottom there. It's a quote that we took from Osama bin Laden himself. And he'll also make the case that Islam is threatened because of this globalization process and the incursion of Western culture, that the values and belief system in Islam are threatened as a result, and therefore Islam must be defended. So therefore, given that premise, he made this statement that you see in blue. Acquiring chemical and nuclear weapons for the defense of Muslims is a religious duty. So we have this transition of the acquisition of weaponry and capabilities, all the way from a single rifle to multiple rifles, the arming of nations, and to asymmetrical that has the capability of inflicting significant damage on thousands of people, to the goal and intent of acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Next slide. And if you probably read some of the news, you saw that the Secretary of Defense recently had made the observation that we here in the United States and the West and the Department of Defense are behind our adversary in the use of communications. He's very skilled at it. He uses them for his purposes as he needs to, whether it is to recruit from an ideological perspective or to train from a tactical perspective. It's very effective in the way he does that. So everything in this, I'll talk a little bit about the history of jihads. The first jihad lasted 897 years, but this particular jihad that we're in right now has accelerated because of the capabilities of communications. Where once before it was just a book that motivated somebody that you had to pass around, now you have instant access to millions of people. Next slide. And then finally, he's got increased ambitions. And all the way through the reestablishment of the Caliph. And I just want to point out that that in itself is not necessarily bad, because the desire to reestablish Islam when it was preeminent in its cultural and its influence, why would we say that's a bad thing? But to achieve that through violent means is the thing that we are very concerned about. The establishment of the Caliph, the dream of reestablishing that, is not only necessarily, we don't find that just within Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda associated movements. What you see there is a quote from his Tauher from Indonesia. I know I messed up the name a little bit, but look at that quote there. He talks about reestablishing the Caliph himself. Implementing the righteous Caliph, because the Caliph is the only state which will be capable of eliminating American and British hegemony from the constellation of international politics. And I'll talk more about that in the following slides. Next slide. This is another picture of the Caliph, and I'm going to show you one more actually on top of that. But what the purpose of this particular slide is to show you, as we plotted out some of the recent terrorist acts that have occurred in the Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even Europe. The black line is a Caliph when it was preeminent, and then even in particular, even before the 1400s, the Caliph actually extended to Southern Europe to include Spain. Red are current conflicts, and yellow are recent terrorist attacks. And if you look at them and plot them out, you can't help but see some of the connection that's incurred there. In the military, we do what you call a scatter diagram, or just kind of plot all the different events as they occur, and then normally you can make a connection of where the dots and where the adversary activity is occurring, and that's pretty much what you see on this particular slide. Next slide. I want to further describe the nature of the enemy through his own words. And though most of you should be familiar with a letter that Zawahiri wrote to Zarqawi, maybe 6-9 months or so ago, that was intercepted. And it was pretty interesting to watch how that letter was intercepted, and then it was made public. And I'm glad it was, because it really gives you some really thinking of the nature of the adversary that we're against. As you know, Zawahiri is the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda. He led his own insurgent efforts and had his own ideology that he was propagating in Egypt. He decided to join the ranks of Osama bin Laden when they were in Afghanistan fighting the Russians there. And is a pretty influential guy, and of course, you see him quite a bit on some of the videos that are coming out, even more so than you see Osama bin Laden himself. So he's got, he has thought through very carefully his strategy and the ideology that supports it. And in the letter that he sent to Zarqawi, because Zarqawi had pledged support to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Qaeda leadership, he wanted to give him some strategic guidance. And in the letter that he sent him, he highlighted 4 strategic objectives. The first strategic objective was to expel the Americans and establish an Islamic authority in Iraq. And what's really interesting is he describes the means to accomplish this strategic objective and the lessons that he takes out of American history, primarily with public opinion and the lack of public opinion from the Vietnam War and the history of Americans, how adverse we are to casualties, and how he quotes those in his letter himself. Pretty interesting. So the purpose there is to remove America and Western influence from Iraq and establish Iraq as a base of operations and make it a radical state under Sharia law. Next slide. The second objective was to remove what you call, in one of the previous slides had alluded to it, these apostate governments. Those governments that do not believe in necessarily what the extremist ideology believes in. And the governments that he referred to that must be removed were Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Egypt. And you already see that Zarqawi is executing some of this to accomplish the strategic objectives, and some of the recent attacks, and even some of the attacks that even are planned that actually make it into the public press. The attacks in Jordan, the attacks in Egypt, and that particular area. As we looked at the scenario on how it might play out, we put some what-ifs in there in red. Would there be continued attacks against the West? Would Israel join the conflict? And then if the United States was removed from Iraq, or we voluntarily left Iraq, would we, once these other attacks started occurring, these governments became threatened, would we re-enter the conflict? The third objective is very revealing, and that is to destroy Israel, the Zionist state. It's always been an objective, as you know. Extremist ideology, this element of extremist ideology supports a one-state solution in the Palestinian-Israeli peace efforts. But the extremists would threaten Israel, and Israel would be defeated and eliminated. The Zionist state would be eliminated. But at this particular point, you can't help but start asking some what-if questions. Would nuclear weapons be used? Well, how would Israel react? To what level, defensive level, would Israel use to protect themselves? Would attacks from the West continue? And then at what point does the United States return to the Middle East? And the fourth objective is in this slide here, and that is to restore the historical caliphate. Now this is, granted, the third picture that you've seen of this caliphate, but I took this one off an extremist website because I want to show you some things there that help describe what the strategic objectives are and some of the other strategic objectives. This is not a slide, this is not our talking, this is from an extremist website itself. They call it the Map of the United States of Islam. And what they show in there that you see are Islamic countries today that are colored in green. And if you drop all the way down to the lower right-hand corner, you see those countries that would be green in the strategic objective of reestablishing the caliphate and beyond 100 years from now, and that would be the entire country. I mean, the entire world. You can't see it from these particular slides, but in that one block right to the left of the block that says after 100 years in the southern part, that's located in the southern part of Africa, there's some very revealing things in there. Let me just quote them out to you. It says that we would have the biggest army, we would have the largest currency, we would be the largest country, and we would be an atomic superpower. And so those are some of the characteristics of the United States of Islam as they reestablish the caliph there. Okay, so that kind of gives you the objectives and the strategic objectives and some of the thinking on the nature of the enemy. Obviously you'll agree it's pretty radical. But there are always some vulnerabilities associated with this, and I just want to cover a couple of them. And the key point of this slide is that the enemy's ideology is not popular among most Muslims, or the average Muslim. And thankfully a vast majority of Islam, who incidentally, whose very name means peace, would not buy this particular ideology. Because they show themselves adversaries to the West, and they also at the same time show themselves adversary to a great majority of Islam itself. And ultimately, what we need to do and what our strategy needs to address is how to undermine the support by amplifying moderate voices and highlighting the enemy's corrupt and repressive behavior. And that's really one of its vulnerabilities. So looking at the vulnerabilities and looking at the nature of the enemy and looking at the nature of the war, what I want to do next is talk to you a little bit about our government strategy and our military strategy. And this is what I think is probably some of the most important things that I could tell you today. This is a revision of the government's counterterrorism strategy. It was released publicly by Fran Townsend in a speech she made last fall to the U.S. Institute of Peace. It was approved by the President last June. It has two strategic ends or aims: to defeat violent extremism as a threat to our way of life and to establish a global environment inhospitable to violent extremists. And if you stop and think about slavery today versus what slavery was 100 years ago, we try to make the connection between how we would view terrorism today and how that strategic end would view slavery 100 years from now, or terrorism 100 years from now. 100 years ago, slavery was accepted for the most part, but today, through all ethnicities and societies, is pretty abhorrent. Terrorism today is a lot of people and a lot of ethnicities accept it as a means to accomplish ends. But the intent there is that 100 years from now, maybe even 10 years from now, it would be considered inhospitable and abhorrent. And then we have three ways or three strategic aims that are indicated in those blue arrows that are pointing up: a defensive element, an offensive element, and one that deals with the ideology. And I'd love to hear the Secretary of Defense talk about, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, what he had to do to defend our country from what he thought was going to be a follow-on attack. And we had to shut down our airspace, we had to shut down our borders, and then the legislation kicked in. We established the Patriot Act that even is highly debated today. But the bottom line is, with the defensive element of our strategy, life as we know it for free open societies has changed significantly. So although we may argue that you need a defensive element, we in the Department of Defense would argue that cannot be our only defensive element. We need to have a defense in depth, or one that includes an offensive element. And that's indicated by the one in the middle there of attacking terrorists and their capacity to operate effectively at home and abroad. And really, you got to ask yourself, and if you look at that bell-shaped curve and that population on the far right that has a potential population that support that particular ideology of 12 million personnel, are you killing them faster than they are being created? Is that bell-shaped curve moving to the right or moving to the left as a result of your offensive actions? I guess the one metric I like to say unclassified is the fact that since 9/11, as we look at new terrorist organizations that have emerged, that have the same ideology as Al-Qaeda and their associated movement, we're over 30. So you probably can make the case by that metric that we are not killing them faster than they are being created. So you got to ask yourself, fundamentally, how are you going to win the war on terrorism? And that's that third element, and you got to go and you got to deal with this ideology. And what that says is we support mainstream Muslim efforts to reject violent extremism. And as you go back to that spectrum of ideologies, what that strategic objective says is that within this war of ideas, in this struggle of ideas of how to deal with modernity, it's as moving into the incursion of the West into Islam. Do we deal with it with plurality and tolerance and inclusion through dialogue, or do we do it with a violent radical interpretation of Islam and reject it totally? The struggle of ideas that's going on, that strategic objective says that we, the United States, enter into that struggle of ideas and we put ourselves in between moderates and extremists. And it's not that we make the case of United States and Western values, because as you know, every time we open our mouth, we just come with the baggage of our culture. But the objective says that we enable moderates to make the case to that bell-shaped curve to the Islamic population in order to try to move that bell-shaped curve towards the left. We studied jihads over the centuries, and this is an interesting study. And we wanted to find out what started jihads and what terminated a jihad. And most Islamic historians would agree that we are in the fifth jihad. This one incidentally started with the assassination of Anwar Sadat because he had made peace with Israel, he was considered apostate, and with the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. As I said before, the first jihad lasted 897 years, so when you talk about a long war, it kind of gives you some perspective. But really, a jihad, if you understand what a jihad means, it means enduring struggle. So enduring by itself, by definition, doesn't necessarily have a beginning or an ending. But what jihads have is periods of activity and periods of abatement of that activity. So we tried to study what caused the activity and where the activity abated. And what we found is that activity stopped, radical activity stopped, when Islam became introspective, when moderates collapsed upon extremists. And the reason, because of the activity of the extremists, they put the Ummah and its legitimacy at risk. And the paradox of it all was that only Islam was able to defeat this radical wing within Islam. It wasn't anything that anybody outside of Islam was going to be able to do. This introspection had to occur. And that's what the strategic objective is saying, that we would enter into this war of ideas to facilitate the introspection, to enable moderate voices to make the case to the rest of Islam, that the way to the future, the way we would deal with modernity, is through tolerance, plurality, and inclusion. And then you have three cross-cutting enablers that you see that are indicated in yellow. And this is so extremely important. The first one has to do with partners and building partnership and building partner capacity. And in the 21st century, one of the unique problems that we deal with all the time that is unique to the 21st century that we didn't see prior to this war is how do you defeat an enemy that exists within the borders of a country that you're not at war with? So what you have is, the example I like to use is, we in the United States had our own domestic terrorist a few years ago. His name was Timothy McVeigh. You're all familiar with him. But we were able to find him, to track him down, to apprehend him, to bring him to trial in a fair and just judicial system, and then to punish him. So the idea of that strategic enabler is that if the countries that we are partners with in the war on terrorism had the will and the capacity to be able to track terrorists down within their borders and to bring them to trial in a fair and just judicial system and to punish them, it would certainly make our job a whole lot easier. The second enabler is very important. I guess if you remember a couple of years ago, back in the debates between the presidential election, both sides of the aisle agreed on only one thing, it seemed, and that was the number one threat to the United States of America. The most serious threat is the weapons of mass destruction in the hands of a terrorist. So that strategic enabler, that second one there, talks about keeping the world's most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the world's most dangerous people. And the third is that we recognize that this war is a long war, and there has to be some institutionalization that must occur, both domestically and overseas. And that's necessary that we put that in place. So that's our United States government strategy, again approved by the President last June. And in order to take the government strategy and its applicability to the Department of Defense, last March the Department of Defense approved the National Military Strategy that was incorporated into the National Military Strategic Plan for the War on Terrorism. And the unclassified version is what you see up there. And in an ends, ways, means format, you have that strategic goal to preserve and promote a way of life of free and open societies. And then you see that little thing in red there. And what we in the military and the Department of Defense have done is that we try to define terrorist organizations and networks by what does that organization need to operate and survive. And as we looked at that network, obviously it needs water and it needs air to breathe and stuff like that, but we concluded that there were 9 key elements that it needed to operate and survive. It's leadership, it's safe havens, intelligence, it's weapons, it's financing, it's foot soldiers, it's ideology, and so forth. So focusing on that particular description of the adversaries, networks, and organizations, and overlaid on the 3 strategic elements of the government strategy are 6 military strategic objectives that you see in yellow. And the first one is focused directly on terrorist organizations and networks, and that is to deny terrorists the resources they need to operate and survive, because the thought is that if he needs this resource to survive and to operate, it becomes a vulnerability, and that's the focus of how we would deny that. So it's one of the focus of how we would operationalize that in our strategies. And then piggybacking off the government strategy about partnership, we also understand the importance that we in the military play of enabling partner nations. And then the third is how we in the military attempt to keep the world's most dangerous weapons out of the world's most dangerous people with weapons of mass destruction, and some of the means to accomplish that is establishing STRATCOM as a global supported combatant commander for combating weapons of mass destruction. The fourth objective is the bread and butter of the Department of Defense, and that is defeating terrorists and their organizations. The fifth deals with state and non-state support and how we would deal with that. And then finally, which is very important, although we would not have the lead necessarily in dealing with the ideology, we in the Department of Defense play a significant role in contributing to the conditions which counter ideological support to terrorism. And we do that through a variety of means, all the way from being there on the ground, providing security so institutions can be built, to providing humanitarian assistance, to information operations, to our military contacts with partner militaries, and finally to how we conduct operations and to minimize collateral damage and all of that sort of thing. Next slide. What I want to show you is to take that strategy, the Department of Defense's strategy, and to give you an idea how it would be applied globally from a global war on terrorism, because what you see primarily in the news, obviously, for the global war on terrorism are activities in Iraq and activities in Afghanistan. And although that would be the main effort, and what you see in the red block there, it would be the priority is to defeat al-Qaeda in their movements in Iraq and Afghanistan. Supporting efforts would be to isolate and then defeat al-Qaeda's senior leadership in Pakistan, improve governance, and build capacity. And then other supporting efforts in the yellow block include reducing and denying expansion into some of the safe haven areas, to include North Africa, Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia, and then to build partnerships. And some other means to accomplish those strategic objectives are in the blue box there in the upper left-hand corner. Eliminate self-havens, build capacity, amplify moderates, improve governance, secure weapons of mass destruction, the offensive element of attacking terrorists, develop partners, education and train, and so forth. So the one piece that you may be familiar with and what you think the Department of Defense would be solely focused on in terms of attacking terrorists, you can see that there is a variety and a larger spectrum of other type of operations that we would conduct as well. Next slide. I know it's a busy slide, but I want to kind of whet your brain a little bit about how the government is organizing itself as a result of the 9/11 Commission and the legislation that was passed to create the National Counterterrorism Center. And if you don't have an idea of what's happening over at NCTC, you should read up on it, because you would be very pleasantly surprised. And they're doing some great work. The United States government developed a United States government strategy there. That's that national strategy for countering terrorism. But in order to operationalize the government strategy, the NCTC is tasked to write a government plan called the National Implementation Plan. First time in the history of our government that we would do something like that. Historic. It will assign tasks and responsibilities to all departments and agencies of the United States government to execute the strategic objectives in the strategy. And what you will see for the first time is an integration of all the activities of our government in the war on terrorism. And if you remember back to your grade school days, the derivative of integration is integer, and integer means whole number. And if our government is working as a whole in this effort, it would be, I don't want to say it would be a first, but it would certainly help quite a bit to get us there. In the middle there in blue are the Secretary and the Chairman's plans. And the Secretary has his National Defense Strategy. And then we have what you heard me talk about, the National Military Strategy for the War on Terrorism, which includes the Military Strategic Plan and our military strategy. What's unique in that plan, beside the strategy I showed you, is the fact that we are establishing the Special Operations Command as a global support and combatant commander for the war on terrorism. Because although Goldwater-Nichols did not necessarily give us a general staff, it gave us a joint staff, therefore we don't have anybody that commands and controls operations from a global perspective. And since this is a global war on terrorism, our Secretary of Defense was faced with the dilemma of how do I have a single combatant commander look at this from a global perspective. So he established Special Operations Command, brought him out of a functional command to make him both a functional and operational command. And then SOCOM has the task to write campaign plan, a global campaign plan, which they're doing right now, and they're doing a great job of that. Each of the regional combatant commanders have already written their regional plans. They will be updated, and they will become integrated into the global campaign plan. And then we will also have a con plan to deal with each one of the designated terrorist organizations that we are dealing with globally. And then if that terrorist organization resides within a combatant commander's area of responsibility, that combatant commander will have the responsibility of writing a supporting plan to that particular con plan. So what you see in this particular slide is a government strategy with a government plan, a Department of Defense strategy with a Department of Defense plan, integrated together, and I think that's pretty good. Go all the way to the top on the National Security Strategy, and underneath that to the left, it's got the NSPD/HSPD. And this is being prepared even as we speak. National Strategic Presidential Directive, Homeland Security Presidential Directive. It gives the authorities for that particular strategy that I showed you. The NSPD will also direct that each department of the United States government develop a strategic plan. So you're not only going to have a military strategic plan, you're also going to have a diplomatic strategic plan, a judicial strategic plan, and an economic strategic plan for the war on terrorism. It will further direct NCTC to develop a set of government metrics to measure progress, and it will also direct each department to develop a set of department metrics that will become integrated into the government set of metrics as well. So you're not only going to have a government strategy with a government plan, you're going to have department strategies with department plans and a set of metrics that will measure progress in all of that. Okay, next slide. All right, let me go now transition to the last part of my briefing, which is really goes back to why a long war. And what does it take to defeat an ideology? And we went back in history and picked up what it took to defeat Nazism and communism. There's an interesting quote from the president that he made here recently last fall when he said that there were previous United States efforts to fight bankrupt ideologies. And the two that he mentioned were Nazism and communism. But the key in all of that is that historically it took the United States' involvement to stand against the violent repressive manifestation of the ideology. And it required patience, and it required promoting reform from within. Next slide. I showed you both the government and the military strategy had a key element that talked about building partnership capacity, because that's a new 21st century dynamic of dealing with how do you go to war against an enemy that's operating within the boundaries of a country that you're not at war with. And a good example to study partnership capacity and its effect and how long it really took to become effective is just the study of South Korea. Just over 50 years ago, back in 1952, Korea was devastated by war in the north, Japanese occupation elsewhere. Its natural, human, and man-made resources were destroyed. It had 95% illiteracy. Its gross domestic product was one of the poorest in the globe. Its economy was almost entirely agriculture, and then enter 50-some years later in 2005, South Korea is known as the Asian Tiger. It's a top 4 Asian economy. Its gross domestic product is equivalent to those within the European Union. Its economy is mostly industrialized. It has one of the most rapidly growing economies for exports since 1980. And probably most important in all of that, it no longer depends solely on the United States for its security, that it has the capability of providing security for itself. But if you look at what it took for South Korea to build capacity and the efforts that we as the United States in supporting that over the last 50 years, we recognize it took time, it became effective, and who can argue with that result? Next slide. Why is this a long war? I try to make the case to you that the enemy is committed to his cause. He's prepared to fight. He is fueled by an ideology. It's a radical ideology that even if you go and study the faith-based system that supports the ideology, he understands that death is just nothing more than moving to a greater place of honor. We also recognize he has local, regional, and global aspirations, and that jihad, defined by enduring, may take a decade, it may take longer, that's immaterial to him. However, winning requires moderates to overcome extremists within the Islamic world, and that's going to take some time to get there. And a significant piece of all of this is the development of partnership capacity, and partnership capacity is not something that's going to be developed overnight. Next slide. What is it going to take for America to commit to a long war? Well, I think first we Americans have to understand our adversary. And then we have to understand what the strategy is to deal with it. I saw a study at the Army War College here recently that was very interesting. It said, what does it take for public resolve over time, historically, in insurgencies that have happened over the years? And it was a result of two competing factors. One is the buildup of institutions. For example, your political institution, your security institution, your economic institution, your infrastructures, and the decrease of conflicts, casualties. And the studies concluded that tolerance, public tolerance, will stay in place for about 3 years, and then it begins to wane. And after 3 years, if you don't get those two variables in place, then what's going to happen is you're going to have significant lack of public support and lack of public resolve. Second point I'd like to make is General Casey, in a recent testimony in his study of insurgencies historically, found that to successfully defeat an insurgency, it takes on the average of 9 years. And to successfully lose an insurgency, it takes on the average of 13 years. You know, for example, the Russians took 20 years to lose in Afghanistan. But success is 9 years on average. So if we can't get the institutions and the casualty rate in balance after 3 years, and that's where we are right now, and it's going to take, successfully, assuming we're going to win in 9 years, you have this 6-year gap to maintain public resolve. And how do you support public resolve in that particular gap? But that's why it's important for America to understand the nature of the adversary that we're up against. Because the implications of failure in Iraq, for all the reasons we went to war in Iraq, if you understand the adversary strategy as I laid it out to you in his own words, the accomplishment of the first strategic objective is for the United States and the West to be removed out of Iraq to establish the Islamic regime in Iraq itself, for all the following purposes. And the implications of those failures are significant. And it's important for America to understand that. And that's important for America to understand our strategy to include building partnership capacity and how long something like that takes. So it is a long war, that's the fact. The important part of all of us is to try to make the case and to help America understand what that commitment looks like. And my last slide is next. The enemy is a threat to our way of life. The United States, with our partners, must be committed. We must be patient. We must be resolute. We are fighting a long war, And decisions we make today will determine how long and how intense this war will be. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll be more than happy to take your questions. First hand. Yes, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
oh.
First hand.
Microphone. If you could just identify yourself and.
Thanks. David Roop from Global Security Newswire. In your presentation and up on the slide there, you say a number of times that the enemy is a threat to our way of life. And this is a statement I've heard a number of officials make, Secretary Rumsfeld recently. But it seems to me like a rhetorical excess. These guys don't have the capabilities of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. They haven't demonstrated that they can run a government or manage a military. It doesn't seem likely that they're ever going to be able to invade our shores or change our form of government. I mean, you do make a strong case that they could topple regimes in the Middle East, but just because they've said they want to conquer the world doesn't necessarily mean that they could ever amass the capability to do so. Could you address that, please? Thank you.
No, I think that's a fair question. A threat to our way of life. I try to mention a little bit about that when, we just look back in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We closed our borders. We closed our airspace. That had significant effects on our economy. It's taken us a good 4 years, maybe even to recover. If we closed, we enacted the Patriot Act, which is hugely even debated today, as you know. But if you look at the civil liberties and the impact on our civil liberties, life as we knew it from before has changed significantly. I think if, can they invade our shores? They probably can't invade our shores with an army significant to overthrow the military of the United States. We would be able to defend ourselves, obviously, but through asymmetrical means, they certainly have the capability of, through conventional munitions, of defeating, and conventional asymmetrical means of defeating and killing a great majority of Americans. In 9/11, they killed over 3,000. If you understand that Osama bin Laden said that if I had the capability of using weapons of mass destruction on 9/11, I would have done so. And I think it's fair to say that if Osama bin Laden or some of these extremist organizations could acquire weapons of mass destruction, they would acquire them. We all know, they actively seek them, and they would use them against Americans in a heartbeat. What is the impact of having an adversary out there that is so committed to destroying your way of life, defending Islam from any incursion from the West, that he would use weapons of mass destruction to do it? Osama bin Laden made a significant change in his strategy when he attacked America in 9/11, because prior to that, all the attacks against American interests were within American interests that resided within the Middle East and Central Asia. But he realized that he had to do something different, and he had to go after where America was not necessarily in the Middle East, but where it was strong, and it was strong at its origin in its homeland, both in its economy and its military. So he attacked specifically our economy, which was the World Trade Center, and our military. And did it have an effect? I think it had a significant effect. I mean, I don't have the economic statistics off the top of my head, but I think we would argue that our way of life changed significantly. But just the fact that how would our way of life be if we knew that we had an adversary that was so committed at destroying us, he had a capability of weapons of mass destruction, and we lived with that fear? What would be the impact of America and how we live today? What would be our economic impact? What would be the impact of our children, knowing that they had that fear? I think it would be pretty significant. So I think there is a threat to our way of life, and whether or not he has the capability of defeating our military, he has the asymmetrical means and the desire to develop the capacity to totally destroy America and establish the strategic objectives that we showed you in his own words. So just another way to look at it.
Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. General, with all due respect, and following up on that previous question, you're militarizing counterterrorism, and that seems to me terribly counterproductive. One thing, you're framing the threat as, quite frankly, as the previous questioner mentioned, that's not terribly credible. A caliphate that includes Spain, India, and Iran. Sunnis will never rule again in Iraq. Destroy Israel, that would take a massive military capability. A world caliphate in 100 years. But the main problem is that your strategy, protect and defend homeland, attack terrorists, support mainstream Muslim efforts, those are basically the efforts of diplomacy, politics, intelligence, and small military units and police. By militarizing counterterrorism, what you're doing is providing and promoting more terrorists, as our ill-begotten war in Iraq has done. And to call it a long war is to really equate it with major conflicts in the past, where in fact we're not confronting 12 million hostile, well-armed people, but really probably no more than 5 or 10,000 that are really combat capable, and that those can be managed without this incredible hyperbole. Doesn't it sort of come to your attention that the militarization of it is in fact making it worse?
Very fair question, and it's something I think that we in the of course we in the military have to balance all of that. Let me just kind of make a couple points there. The strategic objectives that we laid out in here are not the strategic objectives that we interpret Al-Qaeda and their associated movement. These are the ones that he has communicated in his own words. I think it is fair to say whether or not they are attainable within Islam itself. Because whether or not the Sunni Salafism will create the caliphate, given the Shia element and the other sects within Islam, is a thing that can be debated in itself. But what you cannot debate is the fact that these are their words and their desire to do that and to achieve and to use all means possible to include weapons of mass destruction to achieve them. That's not my words of saying that, that's their words to achieve that. And in order to start that process, the United States must be removed from Iraq in order to establish an Islamic radical state ruled by Sharia law. And those are almost words directly quoted out of his own letter. I think let's just say hypothetically, if the United States left Iraq right now, I think hypothetically what would happen? I think you'd have significant sectarian violence. Let's just assume we left Iraq, and let's just say you had a significant civil war that would occur there. I'm not sure I would necessarily agree. I don't know as if we conclude to say that that the Sunnis would not rule that country again. I think Zarqawi would probably have something to say about that, because Zarqawi, with his Takfirism ideology, would say, I do not want any Sunnis to be ruled here whatsoever, that we will establish radical Sunni Salafist ideology ruling that particular country. And I mean, that's just, I know he would have something to say about that, so I'm not sure whether or not Iraq would be Sunni-led if the United States or any Western influence was removed out of there. What would happen if the United States left Iraq? What would happen? And then you would have a significant civil war, and then you'd have some sort of Islamic regime that would be established there. Whether it's Sunni or whether it's Salafist, I don't know at this particular point. But I think Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda would have a significant vote on what would happen and what would happen afterwards. And if you look at phase 2 of this particular thing, they're already executing it. And those are the attacks of apostate governments in the region. And look at the attacks that occurred in Jordan, look at the attacks that occurred in Egypt, look at the attacks that occurred in Saudi Arabia. Those things are happening even as we speak. What would happen? Okay, let's just say what would happen if some of those other countries all of a sudden fell? What would happen to, the flow of oil for the economies of the West? I think all that would have an effect. But, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, it's particularly interesting. I think what you had here is you had a hornet's nest of activity that 9/11 just opened the door and just kind of released it. I think the strategic objectives and the goals, both in ideology and in land occupation, were already there before 9/11. There's just now a reason. I mean, why did Osama bin Laden attack the United States on 9/11? Why did he declare war against the United States, I think, in 1996? Because he realized that the West and the power of the West stood between him and his ultimate strategic objective, and that we would have to be attacked. I guess the debate, therefore, is, are the activities of the West right now militarizing and causing more terrorists, or would those terrorists already have executed their strategy, regardless if the West reacted as we did after 9/11 or not? And I think that's a fair debate. But I would make the argument that in the adversary's own words, he clearly says what his strategic objectives are, and we, the West, stand in between. And, you know, I think maybe the activities of 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11 just propelled the activity to occur, or I don't know. I will agree with you on one thing, however, and this is one of the risks that we have in this particular war, that the offensive element of our strategy plays a significant issue with regard to, you know, creating more terrorists than we are defeating them. And that's why when you look at the government strategy, you have to look at it in context of a defensive element, an offensive element, and why there has to be an offensive element, and then the one that's really going to work effectively in the long run, and that's the ideological element. We can say we want a defensive element, and we'll all clutter around and defend ourselves, but I think we would make the case that it's going to change life as we know it, and we won't accept that. So therefore, we have a defense in depth, and that's why we have an offensive element. And that offensive element is something that we need, but it's not. We recognize it's not going to win for us. And therefore, that's why we have the ideological element. I think the strategy, the government strategy, is right. I think our defense strategy is nested nicely within it. And I think that this activity that we're seeing today, this extremist ideology, would have propagated itself whether we reacted as we did on 9/11 or not. Just kind of my opinion, but that's the counter argument.
Okay.
Got the microphone.
Oh, thank you. Robert Sheretta with International Investor. General, first of all, thank you for making this presentation. You are a brave man. I would say that because of a career in Wall Street, I reduce a lot of these issues, I'm afraid, to dollars and cents. You mentioned earlier that you felt that it would be necessary for, I think you were alluding to State Department and perhaps Treasury, to have their own strategic plan to coincide with what the military is planning here. If we're dealing with the potential of a war or conflict going on until 2012, have you worked out any numbers in terms of what this might cost the American public? And are we going to be honest with the American public in terms of what it would be, not just in military expenditure, but intelligence, actions, etc.? Are we going to lay this out carefully and let them know how many trillions this will cost?
Well, I'll tell you yes, sir, that's a great question. I'll tell you my answer from my perspective, but I'll tell you that since I'm not an economist and I'm not into the budget piece of this, I work with the strategic element, I'm probably not giving you a complete answer, and it may not be totally correct. I do want to make one observation, though, that the GMP of the percentage of GMP for the Department of Defense's budget right now, I think is what, about 3 or 3.5% or something like that. And what was the percentage of the Defense Department's budget in World War II for GMP? It was 35%. Interesting. That's interesting itself. So if we look at dollars, that's one criteria for defining how much this war will cost. But if you look at what it took to defeat Nazism in World War II, to preserve free and open societies and to establish free open societies in Western Europe, that 35% of our GMP back then, would we be willing to, do we recognize this threat as significant as we recognized the threat in 1942? And would we commit to 35%? Would we commit to 4.5% of our GNP, not so much 35% of our GNP? Those are some hypothetical questions. The good news is that 3.5% of our GNP were able to accomplish this particular strategy. The QDR, the Quadrangular Defense Review, that analyzed the means necessary to accomplish the Department of Defense's strategy, said this is how much it's going to take for that particular thing. But it is a worthwhile comparison to look at what our GNP is today as it was to defeat a previous ideology called Nazism 60 years ago.
Yes, Major?
Go ahead, I can hear you. Good command voice.
I'm Major Ewing. I'm with the Office of the Chief of the Army Reserve, G5, Strategic Planning. Thank you, ma'am. I don't actually like these things either. I'm just curious, this may or may not be in your lane, sir, but do you happen to know if someone is coming up with a formal international campaign plan for media? And I'm not talking about PSYOP, as you know, that's separate, but I'm talking about media. For example, in Iraq, you're talking about, you use the term amplifying moderates. I'm assuming people like al-Sistani, who is doing a fairly decent job of hurting the Shiites at this time. And on a personal note, it'd be interesting to see what happens if he dies, what the Shiites are going to do after he's gone. But anyway, is someone kind of in charge of trying to leverage the media, particularly in places like Iraq right now?
Yeah, let me talk to you about, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up. Let me talk to you a little bit about from the Department of Defense and from the government perspective. Enabling moderate Muslims to reject violent extremism, that element of the strategy is falling upon the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Ms. Karen Hughes. And she has a variety of means to accomplish that strategic objective. Principal among those means are to establish a government strategic communications effort. And she has her own strategy and how she's going about doing that. She established what she calls a brain trust, which is an interagency group of personnel which support her. We in J5 on the Joint Staff plug into her very nicely. And I think, and I give her a lot of credit, she's really moving out on this sort of effort. She's taken some tomatoes to her face, but she is trying to understand what's going on, and she is bringing the strategic communications message and organizing the government to deal with that. But that strategic communications is just not so much giving a message out. It's establishing that other strategic objective, institutions, whether they're educational institutions or economic institutions, and this in support of this long war. The Department of Defense, the Quadrangular Defense Review recommended that the Department of Defense establish a strategic communications secretariat between the Secretary's staff and the Chairman's staff, and that is already being put in place. And the purpose of the Strategic Communications Secretariat is to develop strategic communication themes to support the war on terrorism and to bring them out to the American public, three different audiences: the American public, our international partners, and the adversary, to address the adversary, and primarily those three audiences. In addition, they would have a capability to address spot reports that come up on the screen that are 24 to 48 hour type things that occur, and all of a sudden there's some claim that occurs in the news, and that we would have to respond to it, and they would have the capability of doing that. And one of the purposes of the Strategic Communications Secretariat in the Department of Defense is to plug into the greater government effort that Karen Hughes is doing as well. So I think it's fair to say that the government has organized itself right now to put a strategic communications effort together with multiple means to accomplish that objective, but we still have a ways to go to make it effective.
Yes.
Speak up, please, or maybe a microphone could be passed over to you.
Camille Caesar, Commerce Department, Bureau of Industry and Security. First, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really tremendous. And I certainly admire your vision and your willingness to suggest that the world is centuries from now. Would you use the microphone, please?
Speak into it now, please.
Speaking into it?
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Your willingness is to suggest that the world 100 years from now could be very different than it is today. I think that we have an innate reluctance to accept that, and certainly, although the sun never set on the British Empire in the late 19th century, it didn't take 100 years for that to change. My question, though, returns to the map, the green map. And it isn't really so much about the capability of extremist Islam to expand throughout the globe. My real desire for information from you relates to how they really want to do this. I guess most of the world consists of places where people are, very attached to pork products and drink a lot. And so I'm wondering, is the plan to just get rid of these people and repopulate these areas with adherents and repopulate them with people like Al Qaeda and their co-religionists, or is the desire to really convert people? I mean, I think this is just something I don't really know much about. I think it's something that we don't really think much about. I mean, what's the end game from the Al Qaeda perspective? Is it going to be a culture war through persuasion, conversion, or just through sort of, I don't know, ethnic cleansing or something like that? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question. You got this extremist element. I guess the fundamental question is, are they irreconcilable or not? Newt Gingrich says they're irreconcilable radicals that must be removed. And they'll probably remove themselves through attrition warfare. But if potentially you have 12 million of them, that's a big pool that you're going to have to deal with. I personally feel that there will be an irreconcilable element that we will deal with over a long period of time. But I think the great majority are caught in the midst of these competing ideas that are occurring within Islam right now. And who is making the case, and where is that case being made? In the Joint Staff, we really got keyed up on this introspection idea within Islam based on the history of the jihads. So what we do, we have this element that within the Joint Staff called this countering ideological support branch. And they spend a lot of time studying where introspection is occurring within Islam, within the different elements of the society through all the different strata. And we look at introspection that occurs within moderate governments, and then we look at where it occurs within their economies, where it goes down into their provincial governments. But what we realize where the introspection really has to occur is within the first line influencers, and those are really the mullahs at the local madrasa, and the parents, the mothers and fathers. Because when a kid decides that he wants to join jihad and become a suicide jihadist, before he makes that decision, if you understand the radicalization process, he just doesn't say, I want to become a suicide jihadist. There are seeds of discontent. There is that loss of honor and dignity that he wants to retaliate against. And he goes to seek advice from the local mullah and from his mother and his father a lot of times. And then as he seeks that advice, he makes his decision, and then he just gets basically put into the system and then until he commits the act. But it's those local influencers are the ones that we really have to get down to make the case that plurality, tolerance, and inclusion must be included in the debate of ideas. What's really interesting is when you really sit down with those who have extremist or these seeds of discontent that are very ripe for extremist ideology, and you sit down with them in a way that you can sit down and listen and explain an opposing view so that they have the opportunity to listen, it's amazing some of the results that come out of it. We looked at reconciliation efforts that are going on in Islam right now, and we found 2 or 3 that are successful. The first reconciliation effort that is successful is Karzai himself in Afghanistan. He's taken and reached out to some of the Taliban. He's actually offered them the olive branch to come back into the society, into the Afghan society, and if they would renounce what they had done previously, he would put them back into the tribe that they came from and be assigned a mentor. And that mentor would be responsible for them as they go back into the reconciliation process and become supporting citizens. And he's having tremendous results. That's not to say all of them are being reconciled, but there is a good number that you'll never see in the press that are really into this program that it's working very well. The second is a judge in Yemen. And this particular judge in Yemen said, I really want to go into the Quran and I want to sit down with some of these irreconcilables and explain to them. Interesting. If you study the Quran, which is the origin of this extremist ideology, is the same document, the same religious philosophy that is the origin of tolerance and peace. It just depends which verses you want to read from. Some people say you can make the same case with our Bible for those of us who are Christians, depending what you want to read. But so what this judge in Yemen has done is he's taken the Quran and he sat down with these irreconcilables and walked them through very logically the argument of tolerance and peace and inclusion, and has made the case with the same literature that they thought gave them the ideology of radical extremist Islam and the expulsion of the infidel. And as a result, yeah, it should be great. And as a result, they make the decision to renounce their extremist ideology, and he will release them and put them into society. And I forget the numbers that he's actually released, but not a single one has gone back and become a recidivist and gone back into the fight, because they're making the case. So I think there is not going to be any ethnic cleansing. There is always going to be this element that are irreconcilable, but I think there are some reconcilable efforts that are working. And as we enable moderate voices to make the case to reject violent extremism, have to be very careful of how we enable moderate voices through all elements of the society, particularly the first-line influencers.
Waiting very patiently. This will have to be the last question, unfortunately. Thank you.
Nancy Berg. I wanted to ask you, General, on your commonality slide, you gave an extended military presence, U.S. military presence, as one of the factors that has brought about success, and I wonder if that is part of the plan here. I think it's quite different in terms of ideologies and situations. We don't have time to discuss that, but also that would factor heavily in the cost. So I'm wondering if you're trying to do that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Within moderate Islam and within the majority of Islam, as strong as the antibodies are against extremist Islam, equally as strong are the antibodies against occupation. And within Islam, particularly when that occupation is from Western cultures, because inherently you have Western culture that is a value system that is opposed to a value system within Islam. So there's an inherent difference there as well. It's not so much how moderate Islam is going to deal with the incursion of Western culture in terms of accepting it and it becoming part of their life, like a secularist Islamist would be, but rather whether they would deal with it in terms of tolerance and plurality instead. But what is adverse from its beginning is to have Western culture staying and living in and amongst Islamic culture, and that in itself is pretty tough. And the occupation of the West into the holiest of lands of Islam is something that they're very sensitive to. So we recognize that, military presence. What would be the purpose of military presence? I mean, the purpose of military presence would be to provide a security apparatus so institutions can grow. That would be the purpose. If that purpose can be met through other means, for example, if you can raise an indigenous security apparatus, in other words, building partnership capacity, building a military, building police, building border security, building a successful non-corrupt judicial system, if that can serve its purpose, then a foreign military doesn't have to provide that security, and then the indigenous security can be in place, and then the institutions can grow instead. And that's where ideally we would want. And those would be the conditions, and that's when General Abzade and Casey talk about the conditions of removal of security from Iraq and Afghanistan. It's conditions of an indigenous security apparatus that can protect the functions and establish those functions to grow, economic functions and things of that sort. But we fully recognize that as strong as the antibodies are towards extremism for moderates, those antibodies exist for occupation, particularly Western occupation. So
I'm afraid that's all we have time for in terms of questions. We're very grateful to General Caslen for coming over to share his perspective from the Pentagon and to engage in dialogue with this group. Our next session is March 20th, as I mentioned. It's on Al-Qaeda with a specialist coming over from the Marine Corps University. Please join me now. Thank you, General Caslen, for stimulating speech.
Thank you.
How are you? Nice to see you again.
One thing, they have to agree to say, beat Navy, go Army, beat Navy. Otherwise,
They're not going to do that.
then they got to do some push-ups.
Okay, I'm going to do that for me. So what does it look like?
If you can just give me a call or my executive assistant. I don't have my camera. Love to support something like that.
So I play. Oh, busy week. Okay. Let me give you April. Can do that. Okay.
Oh, great. Well, I guess the big challenge is they knew that
When we did it at its best, we understood very big divisions amongst the economies.
that's a very good point. That's what it is. Identifying the goals. Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, so this is snail. And now we'll look at April.
I'd say Karen uses to do a great job. She isn't. Why weren't we doing it 4.5 years ago? Actually, I testified on that 2 weeks ago. It's not just as easy as replicating. Yeah, exactly. So you buy coastal? Do you go?
Yeah, but I mean, I live here, but
Right.
I'll be May and June out of here.
Oh, I see. So it's not constantly back and forth, right? Oh, that's
well, I
good.
do. I go back. I'll be out in April for a couple of days. I've been out since when was I last? November. So I'm bouncing around.
Good. That's good. See you. Yeah, different place. There's still, except with China. Yeah. That's where there's a mutual demand. Even with the Middle East, there's demand for people with Salafism, Takfirism, that type of thing. Yeah. Not country studies. Not what we used to do, which meant, exactly, which meant that our information is that much more needed.
Hello, Bruce. Good. You're good to see you, Bruce. Yeah.
Yeah, this is taking care of yourself. You look like that's an illusion.
Oh, I'm back in the same thing. Semester before and this semester I take chips, everything you have off there. For me sitting over there.
Great.
Take care.
Good to see you.
This is violation of the military.
But just let us know what, how good the general
Yes.
okay? Thank you very much.
It's probably not possible without us putting it together with the script of his words. I think we're going to try to do that. Do you have a card?
He has more capabilities.
Yeah. Here's mine.
Just interject. Thank you so much for doing this. I hope this was useful for your perspective. It was great. And you have a few more questions. Bruce and I just have to huddle for a moment.
Thanks very much.
Glad the schedule worked out.
I know Mr. Dobbins wants to talk to you.
Yes.
And get some feedback. We'll arrange to get much feedback.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. So the notes section, that way, the information on this.
What's that kind of thing on the web right now?
Well, I hope the questions discussed. That's a corollary.
Okay, Thank you. You're so welcome.
I guess the question is, if you have a government they're operating within the borders we look at the global war should not just be focused on Afghanistan.
So you see the bones.
Well, see, we gotta take the time for that. We gotta,
Well, we're in the, let's see, we're in
The neck out.
Yeah, they all have a common basis. Very nice to see you, sir.
Philippines.
There's counterexamples to what I'm doing, but those are tiny amounts of money. While we're giving the massive amount of money they're going to each of the back centers.
The requirements that Egypt and Caslen service are not necessarily cases that ungoverned. In fact, they brought in more investment. Israel has the capability to govern. Came in. Pakistan has the capability of governing their own area. Maybe outside of the areas outside of the So then, well, that's another issue, a political issue with the United States, Pakistan's government, central government. Does Egypt have the capability of governing their areas? Probably not. So maybe they need capacity different than government purposes. But I think, there's not a good solution. You can't apply the standards for building part of capacity for Egypt and the big ones that we support, like peace and Israel, that you do for some of the areas that do need some capacity, like the transitional area.
Okay. Thanks again for the time. No, I was. About 2 o'clock. Oh, you did?
Well, come on by and we'll give you our national military ones. We got a lot on classified stuff, military strategic plan stuff.
Do I go to defenselink.mil and the National Military Strategic Plan for the War on Terror? Go to communications.
Don Wolfensberger, the Congress project here at the Wilson Center. I want to get one fact straight. I mean, you say that my estimate is there. Yeah, 10% of the.
Yeah.
It's 1% of 1.2 billion.
Oh, okay.
It's if supported by 1% of Muslim population equates to 12 million dedicated extremist costs. And that was the thing there. So if you take that bell-shaped curve and you say that extremist ideology on the far right, let's just say that 1% of Islam agreed to that ideology. That was just 1%. And that's a conservative number by most Islamists.
Okay. Yeah, that's what adversary meant.
They would say that that is, 1% of 1.2 billion is 12 million.
Yeah.
Other people say there's not 1.2, there's 1.4 billion, which means that's not 12 million, it's 14 million.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you much. I enjoyed it.
Still a significant number.
Sure.
General Will, I'm a Schroeder Catholic U Law School. You made the point at the end about resistance to occupation, especially by Westerners. This is the point that General Odom, the former head of NSA, has made, that we're creating terrorists. The question is what you do about it. Well, first I was wondering, are you familiar with what Odom has had to say on this and how he can respond to it? Second, if our presence has the potential of creating more terrorists than we're killing, what do you think of the concept put forward by people like Lawrence Korb of a redeployment? I mean, not pulling all our troops out, but maybe pulling them out of the cities, putting them in Kuwait. I mean, where they're present to move in quickly as needed, but where you're not just rubbing salt in people's wounds and inflaming people.
We were doing an heartbeat. As a matter of fact, the majority of the provinces in Iraq that are not violent have no U.S. presence whatsoever. Where the insurgency festers itself, where it will establish its own Sharia law, where it creates bombs, it builds bombs, it transports bombs, where leaders occupy and plan and organize. That's where we are. So we can remove ourselves out of there, but what we leave instead is a safe haven for planning and organizing. You just can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways until the security can establish itself in that particular country. Those are the conditions that will allow our withdrawal. If the indigenous forces can provide that security, those are also conditions that provide that withdrawal. The fact is that security has got to be established at the local level, the regional level, and at the national level. And once security is established at all those levels, then we're no longer there. It's conditional based, not necessarily theory based. Because you can't apply the theory because all of a sudden you violate all kinds of other principles by the application of that.
Well, the people who are calling for a redeployment of coalition forces are assuming that you've got indigenous forces that can bear the brunt. I mean, this is the point that General Petraeus has made.
Well, give me a break. Let's picture Fallujah. Remember Fallujah, how bad Fallujah was? Well, can Iraq accept Fallujah in the heart of the country?
Right. No, because...
Okay, all right, they can't. So that's why you need security forces. If the United States cannot, if Iraq can provide the security to remove bad guy forces, insurgency forces from Fallujah, we would rather see them do it, right? If they are incapable of doing, then who's got to do it? We're going to do it. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have the insurgency go away because the insurgency won't go away. It will establish itself, it will create safe havens, and all the other activities associated with the safe haven will begin to occur when you lose security. So the security has to be in place first. And why does security have to be in place? So that institutions can grow. Political institutions, economic institutions, infrastructure, and stuff like that. And once that grows and it can establish itself, and the institution itself can provide security, it creates the conditions for our departure. But yeah, I mean, we are antibodies. We recognize we're antibodies, but there's nothing, what's worse? What's worse? Is to allow the safe haven to occur so that we don't create the antibody, or to allow the safe haven not to occur and we are the antibody? So we will be a temporary antibody until the security apparatus can establish itself.
What I'm playing off of is what one of the colonels on the ground in Iraq had to say on a recent frontline piece called "The Insurgency." It ran within the last couple of weeks. And he says basically, you know, I can't be beaten. But by myself, I can never win. With indigenous allies to handle the security thing, yeah, we're going to win. But by myself, I can't. I can't lose, but I can't win either.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he, by himself, he is an antibody.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he will never win as long as he's the antibody. But he still provides the security. But his presence, the purpose of his presence is to allow the indigenous security to grow. So that once you allow the security and put the security in place, the rest of the governance can grow and people can live lives as they choose to live. You see? But the theory that you can remove yourself in order not to create a terrorist is some of the most faulty, illogical theory that you can apply. It just doesn't make sense. And you can just, I mean, you almost have to laugh about it when someone starts talking like that. And the simple answer is just look at Fallujah. I mean, everybody can relate to Fallujah. Can we accept another Fallujah? Because when we draw ourselves, we create a safe haven, that you're going to have that type of activity. And can we accept that or not?
No.
If you say we're going to accept it, then you essentially accomplish phase one of this four-phased strategic effort.
No, clearly it's an end game. It's not a roadmap. I mean, the risk is getting into a situation where, you know, there are people who say, well, we're going to be in Iraq 10, 20 years, you know, as if this were Germany or Japan. If we got to stay there 20 years, it proves we're going down the wrong path. Because we haven't succeeded in what we've got to do, which is, of course, build up the indigenous
The
forces.
difference of Japan, South Korea, Germany, and all that with Iraq is the antibodies of presence. We were allowed to stay in Germany, for example, not for the purpose of maintaining security, because within a couple of years, Germany was a secure state, so this institution started to grow. But our purpose was not to provide security. Our purpose was to provide forward basing for the other threat, which was across the border. And as a result, we were providing security just by the fact that we were forward presence. A case, for example, Iraq. If Iraq, for example, felt threatened from Iran, and all of their citizens felt threatened from Iran or Syria, then they would accept our basing for that purpose, but not to provide security to protect an indigenous insurgency within Iraq itself. That's not the case in what occurred in South Korea. They accepted our presence in South Korea not to prevent an insurgency within South Korea, but in order to prevent the North Koreans across the border from coming. And that's why we were there, for that security purpose. The reason we're in Iraq is not to prevent Iran from coming to Syria. It's really to deal with the insurgency that's within the border. It's slightly different, but the basic purpose is the same. Provide security so institutions can grow. Thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you, sir. Gary.
Good job.
Saw you in there at all, man. How you doing?
Good. How are you? Kevin Henderson,
Kevin, how are you doing?
Well done. Well done.
What's going on? How you doing? Good. Saw you sitting here getting lunch. Yeah. Man. Good. Army's good, huh? Good, huh?
Yeah. We're gonna do that. Hi.
Yes. Thank you.
That's what everybody should do when the program over.
What?
What you do, clean up. Every program don't do that.
what you talking about? You doing right.
For
Like,
once, I want to be like everyone else.
No, like Forsyth, 4th floor they have one, shit, nothing, the trays, everything. In the car.
Well, they always clean up. I just get upset because they leave it's a
Yeah.
free meal. I mean, clean up after yourself.
Yep.
That drives me nuts. That's the worst part of the job. Raised in a barn.
Did you find the coaster?
Nope.
I guess you don't know what she's talking about.
No, because the podium is right there.
Well, no, the coasters,
Oh, you know where they at?
they're supposed to be in that,
Yes, they're not in there.
they're not in there. But talking about coasters being in podiums, that's upstairs.
6th floor.
Yeah,
Auditorium. Okay.
In auditorium. The podium's not in there.
I know.
Oh, it must be in the
Oh,
back.
well.
Oh,
Too late now.
I got it. You go ahead. I got it. Cause you know what I'm gonna do? I got them halfway there, then I'm gonna get that big thing and roll it down and put the rest of them on it.
Okay, thank you,
You
Howard.
welcome. Have a nice afternoon.